Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture on the 1912 presidential election. The title of this lecture is Standing at Armageddon, the 1912 presidential election. Standing at Armageddon is the most famous phrase from the most famous campaign speech given by one of the candidates in the 1912 presidential election, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. My name is Joe Postell. I'm an associate professor of politics at Hillsdale College, and really delighted to be talking about this particular election with all of you because it is both the most fascinating modern election we've had in America and also really the most important, I think, modern election in America because of the long-term consequences of this election, what it really meant for all future presidential campaigns. They're all really in the shadow of this 1912 election. And so very happy to be talking about this with you today. Let's jump in here to the slideshow. You can't avoid doing a slideshow about this election because the candidates are so interesting, the events are so interesting, and the images here are so interesting that they have to be shared. This 1912 election was really an election of firsts. And a lot of the things that happened in this election seem actually quite far-fetched to us today, but they are also unprecedented. Just a few of these firsts, and we'll actually talk about even more than I'll list on this slide as we go through the discussion of this lecture. This was the most successful third-party result in modern American election history. In fact, the third-party candidate in 1912 finished ahead of one of the two main candidates from the two main parties. And this is something that doesn't happen very frequently in American history, and it's really never happened since 1900. In addition, this is the worst result for an incumbent president who was running for re-election in modern history. Typically, if the president is an incumbent and is running for a second term in office, the president will at least do relatively well. Maybe the president will lose. That's happened, of course, over the past century, but at least the president will put up a fighting chance, or will put up a fight, will have a fighting chance. That really didn't happen this time. And in fact, the incumbent president in this election in 1912 knew he was going to lose well before the votes were counted and before election day arrived. In addition, this is the first time and the only time that a PhD in political science served as president of the United States. Typically, we would think that somebody who's trained as a scholar in American politics who gets a PhD in political science might be a qualified candidate for president, although it's obviously very rare that somebody from that background would run for president. Being an academic and being a politician, very different things. This is the one time when those two things went together. A very distinguished academic who was president of Princeton became governor of New Jersey and then became president of the United States in this election. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about this election was that there was an assassination attempt 1 month before the election occurred. And in fact, the assassination attempt was very close to being successful. The attempted assassination actually was a close range shot that hit one of the main candidates. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but it was really an incredible event that really is something it's hard to even fathom today, something like this happening. And also a president who won the 1912 election ended up throwing one of the main candidates, one of his political opponents, in jail towards the end of his second term. So there's all kinds of incredible things that happened as a result of the 1912 election that make this just a really critical, fascinating, dramatic event in American history. The central issue of this campaign, though, wasn't really the general election. It wasn't really about the two candidates facing off in the general election in the fall of 1912. Most of the drama, although of course not all of it, but most of the drama actually occurred well before the general election occurred. And that central question was, who's going to be the Republican Party nominee? And just as important, who gets to decide that question? Is it the party that gets to decide that question? If so, who in the party gets to decide that question? Should we do this by a popular election within the party, or should we do it through these, quote unquote, smoke-filled rooms and nominating conventions? And that was really the central question, honestly, of the entire election. but especially of the first and very dramatic portion of this election. So first, let's review who the main candidates were. One of the fascinating things about the 1912 election is that 3 candidates ran in 1912 who either served as president of the United States or would eventually serve as president. And so you have a very distinguished field of candidates in 1912. First, you have the incumbent president, William Howard Taft. Taft was a Republican and was the current president. And he was challenged first by a fellow Republican who also was a former president of the United States and who was a very close friend of Taft's. That, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had become president as a result of the assassination of William McKinley. And so he became president just after 1900. William McKinley won re-election in 1900. This was going to be McKinley's second term as president of the United States. Roosevelt was his vice president. McKinley was assassinated, and therefore Theodore Roosevelt got to serve out most of William McKinley's second term. And then Roosevelt was elected president in 1904. This led to the question in 1908, has Theodore Roosevelt served 2 terms in office, and therefore he ought to step down because he's going to follow the precedent of George Washington? Or has he really only served 1 term because he assumed the presidency as the result of an assassination of President McKinley? And so he wrestles with this question in 1908, and he ultimately decides that he's not going to run for a second full term in office, and he's going to sort of hand the reins over to one of his greatest friends, William Howard Taft. By 1910, Theodore Roosevelt says, I actually don't think that William Howard Taft is a suitable president. He's not appropriate for the Republican Party, and so I'm going to come back and I'm going to challenge him for the nomination and for the presidency, and I'm going to come back for my second now full term in office. So you have 2 presidents, a former president and a sitting president, running for the Republican nomination in 1912. In addition, on the Democratic side, we have the college president turned politician. That's Woodrow Wilson. Sorry for my camera blocking a portion of Wilson's face here. Woodrow Wilson was a distinguished academic, wrote extensively on American politics and political philosophy. In fact, much of his influence today is the result of his academic writings and his scholarly articles and his books rather than his presidency. And then he decides he's president of Princeton, one of the most prestigious colleges in America. And then he decides he wants to get into practical politics. He becomes governor of New Jersey, and then he runs for president and runs as the Democrat. And then the 4th candidate, more minor than the other 3, but still a very important candidate, Eugene Debs, who ran as a socialist and who ends up winning 6% of the vote in 1912. So a 6% result for a non-major party like a socialist or a Green Party or a Libertarian Party. That's a pretty large portion of the vote. And Debs does actually quite well, in spite of the fact that there are actually 3 other candidates taking large portions of the votes in this election as well. So it's really a fantastic example of many parties competing for the presidency, which does not occur very often. Now, again, as I mentioned just a little while ago, really the critical question in 1912 was about who was going to be the Republican Party's nominee. And it was the Republican contest that captured the attention of the nation for a long period of time and really determined how this election was going to play out. The interesting thing here is that in spite of their animosity in 1912 towards each other, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were very good friends, close political associates. Theodore Roosevelt served as, William Howard Taft served as Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War. Roosevelt appointed Taft to be the governor of the Philippines. This was a territory that the United States had occupied after the Spanish-American War. And when Theodore Roosevelt decided not to run for president in 1908, and the irony here will be very clear to us in a few minutes, Theodore Roosevelt used all of his influence within the party and control of the party machines to force the party in a way, or to influence the party to choose William Howard Taft as the nominee. In fact, the selection of William Howard Taft was largely done by a party insider, by a party leader, namely Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, this is going to be a central issue that Roosevelt is now going to change his views on this question in a few years once 1912 rolls around. Again, by 1910, halfway through Taft's first term in office, it turns out to be his only term in office, Theodore Roosevelt says, "I'm coming back. My hat is in the ring," he famously says. He announces in Columbus, Ohio, which of course is Taft's home state. Ohio is a state where the Taft name has a long lineage, and he chooses to announce his candidacy right in Taft's backyard because he sees that Taft is too conservative for the progressive wing of the Republican Party. Not very many people know this today. I'm sure if you tell your students about this, it kind of shocks them at first. But the Progressive Party in the early part of the 20th century, 1912, the Progressive Party was a Republican Party. The Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It was the party of a stronger national government, the party of a strong union, and the party of the northern and commercial elites and interests inside the country. And so Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive, and even Taft called himself a conservative progressive. But Taft's brand of progressivism was too conservative for Roosevelt. Roosevelt says, "I'm coming back to take the presidency from my former friend." And in fact, these two had a very long friendship that turns very ugly in 1912. And really where this turned ugly first was in the primaries where states held those primaries. And so this really gets to the central question in 1912. How should we choose our candidates? Prior to 1912, the typical way in which candidates were chosen is by party leaders at nominating conventions. The conventions would contain all of these delegates who would be sent by their local and state parties to the national nominating convention, and they would discuss which candidate they wanted to nominate. They would construct a platform that held all of the positions that the party took on the major questions of the day. And then once they'd chosen their platform, they would pick all of their candidates, presumably because the candidates were beholden to the platform. So you choose your principles, then you choose your candidates who are in line with those principles. But of course, all of this was done not with the direct democratic process of involving the voters inside the party. It was a kind of indirect democracy or representative democracy in which the people would elect their delegates, and then the delegates would go to the convention and they would have their own free choice over which candidate was going to be the person that would run under the party banner. We talk about things like smoke-filled rooms today, where the delegates would, behind closed doors, without the direct input of the people, choose the candidates for the party. And they would exercise this kind of filtering process. They would filter out the bad candidates. They would choose the good candidates. Presumably, that's the way the system was designed to work. And this would ensure that people who were hostile to or antagonistic to the party's principles would never get the nomination, so that the party could decide for itself what it stood for. But of course, the problem with this mode of choosing candidates is that it's undemocratic. And the party decides for the voters who the candidates are going to be. And Theodore Roosevelt in particular saw this as a betrayal of democracy. He made the entire campaign in 1912 about democracy and the problem of political parties being undemocratic, not really listening to their voters, ignoring the base of the voters. And so this put emphasis on changing the state rules so that they would hold primaries rather than choosing their delegates and letting them decide who the candidates were going to be. And 12 states held primaries in 1912. And of course, if you were a voter in 1912 in the Republican Party, who would you choose? Would you choose Theodore Roosevelt or William Howard Taft? Well, most of them went for Theodore Roosevelt. He's an incredibly charismatic figure. He gives an incredible speech. He presents himself physically very vigorous. You know, he's an image and a personality that people are drawn to. William Howard Taft is more aloof. He's more aristocratic. He doesn't campaign actively. He doesn't use his rhetorical skills to try to win over the voters. And so in all of these primaries, Roosevelt wins. He even wins the big primaries in California and even in Ohio, which again is Taft's home state. This is very embarrassing for William Howard Taft. He's the current president of the United States. He's the incumbent. and he can't even win his own primary for his own party in his own state. And this sets up an incredible contest at the 1912 Republican National Convention, in which Theodore Roosevelt seems to be dragging the party with him, as this image suggests, right? Instead of the party controlling the nominee, it's now the nominee controlling the party. And Roosevelt is out there in front of the party, seemingly dragging the party behind him. In other words, the 1912 election presents the first instance in American politics in which, instead of parties choosing their candidates, the primaries, the voters, choose those candidates. And so you get this setup leading into the Republican National Convention in 1912, where the party has to decide, do we go with what the people in our party want? Do we decide to give the nominee to this person who, even though he's hostile to the party, has the voters of the party behind him? Do we preserve the party from this insurgent candidate who wants to take over the Republican Party brand, who wants to remake the Republican Party in his own image? Or do we preserve the party by denying this person the nomination, even though it means we will probably lose the election in the fall? And William Howard Taft understands that if the party chooses him instead of Theodore Roosevelt, they will lose the 1912 election, but they will keep the principles of the party pure from the influence of Roosevelt. In fact, Taft writes a letter to one of the party bosses in the state of New York, and he says this: I quite agree with you that the victory in November is by no means the most important purpose before us. It should be to retain the party and the principles of the party. Right? We're going to preserve the party even at the expense of losing an election, rather than going with this very popular, very charismatic candidate who wants to take over the Republican Party. It would be worse to win the election with this insurgent candidate than to lose the election and keep our principles intact. And so when they head to the Republican National Convention in 1912 in Chicago, the issue has to do with contested delegates, that some of the states sent delegates for both candidates, and the states themselves couldn't decide which of the slates of delegates was legitimate. So however the party would rule on which candidates' delegates was the legitimate slate of delegates, that would determine who the party's nominee would be. And so it was the selection of the chair who would rule on all of these matters that was the critical question. And the party chose a man named Elihu Root, who is not a very well-known character today, but was a very important politician at the time that he served in this role. In fact, Elihu Root won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912, the same year that he was chair of this convention. Elihu Root was also a very close friend of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt called him the ablest man that has appeared in the public life of this country. And he was Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State, one of the closest, most prominent members of Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet. And Elihu Root, who was a senator from the state of New York at the time that the convention was held, he decided that he was going to rule for Taft, even though he was a good friend of Theodore Roosevelt, because he believed that the party ought to have control over its own identity and its own principles. It should not be led by some candidate who decides that he wants to take over the party. And so Root presides over a series of decisions in which he awards all of the contested delegates to William Howard Taft, thereby awarding really the nomination to William Howard Taft. And this was a very contentious convention. Elihu Root, they had to build barbed wire around the podium where Root stood so that he would not be charged by people who were at the convention. This is an incredibly tense moment in the Republican Party's history. And in fact, the most astonishing thing that happens is that Theodore Roosevelt himself shows up. This was something you were never supposed to do. As a candidate, you were supposed to stay away and let the party choose you, right? Rather than seeking the office was supposed to come to you. This was an old way of thinking about politics in which you shouldn't want to be seen as grasping at power. The office should pursue you rather than you pursuing the office. And Theodore Roosevelt shows up at the convention. And Everyone is astonished that a candidate would do this, would violate such an important tradition, such an important norm. In fact, there's a fantastic quote from the New York Times, of all newspapers, saying this when Theodore Roosevelt showed up to the convention. This vain, wrong-headed, impetuous man, in his mood of shameless self-glorification, has gone to the convention city to browbeat his opponents. Nothing like it, nothing so destructive to the dignity of our institutions was ever dreamed of in the uncouth early days of our republic. This is the New York Times lamenting, chastising Roosevelt for showing up to the convention. And in the face of all of this opposition, Elihu Root, unmoved, decides to award these delegates for Taft and thereby give the nomination to Taft. And of course, as a result of this, what you would expect and what they all knew was going to happen was Roosevelt and all of the delegates that supported him were going to leave. They were going to bolt the convention, which is what happens. And this is the formation of the third party in 1912 that we often call the Bull Moose Party, but was actually called the Progressive Party. The formal name of this party was the Progressive Party. It was founded essentially not as a party so much as a campaign mechanism to elect one person to the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt, which is why we call it the Bull Moose Party instead of the Progressive Party. It was a party named after a candidate. Right? This is the opposite of parties being in charge of candidates. This is now a candidate who's so powerful that the party is named after him. And here's a campaign button from the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, right? The image is of Roosevelt and his reputation. And when Roosevelt shows up to the Progressive Party, the reaction to Roosevelt borders on a sort of religious experience. The accounts of the Progressive Party emphasize how sort of reverent the experience was. The singing of Christian hymns throughout the entire convention, the singing of the battle hymn of the Republic over and over again. Roosevelt goes to give a speech at the convention in which he delivers his famous last line of the speech, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." And the place erupts and they have to calm down by singing the battle hymn of the Republic. The mood at this convention, this was not really a party convention so much as it was a revival, a religious revival, which goes to show how much the candidate's personality was in charge rather than the party's leaders and the party's principles. This is really the importance of the 1912 election. Now, meanwhile, as all of this is taking place, the Democratic Party is kind of doing what parties have always done in the 19th century, and even in the beginning of the 20th century. They're doing their old smoke-filled room method of nomination. And the person who emerges out of this very lengthy contest in which there's all kinds of voting and lots of bargaining and some delegates switch their votes and so forth is Woodrow Wilson, the New Jersey governor, who wins on the 46th ballot in Baltimore. It takes them 46 votes to settle on Woodrow Wilson. And it takes a lot of people, especially William Jennings Bryan, brokering a lot of compromises to finally settle on Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was well known as an academic and as a politician. And on the campaign trail in 1912, he starts to talk about the Constitution in a new way, as an idea of a living Constitution. In fact, Woodrow Wilson embraces the idea of being a progressive. So Woodrow Wilson calls himself a progressive now. So you have Taft as a conservative progressive, Theodore Roosevelt as the Progressive Party nominee, and then Woodrow Wilson embracing progressivism as well. In fact, some of his most famous quotes are from speeches that he gave on the campaign trail in 1912. One famous speech where he talks about the Constitution not being a Newtonian constitution of checks and balances, where the various forces counteract each other, but rather a Darwinian constitution, one that evolves, one that is living, a living constitution that evolves to keep up with the times. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice, Wilson says. All that progressives ask or desire is permission to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. These were things that Woodrow Wilson said on the campaign trail in 1912, talking about a living Darwinian Constitution. And so this one of the central issues, let's say there were two central issues in 1912. One of them was who gets to decide who the nominee is going to be? How democratic should that process be? And the other issue was a policy issue, and it had to do with these things called trusts. Trusts were essentially economic combinations in restraint of trade and competition. These are the people we know as the robber barons of the early 20th century, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and so forth. They would construct these essentially monopolistic combinations where they would essentially close out all competition by controlling all of the aspects of the means of production. The capital you need, the money you need to get business started up, access to the raw materials like mining or drilling for oil or so forth, access to the transportation networks to get your materials around the country to manufacture them or to sell them, and then the manufacturing facilities needed to refine all of the raw materials into steel and oil and so forth. They basically controlled all of these aspects of the economy. So the question was, what do we do with these trusts? And the division between the two main candidates that had basically emerged by the time the fall came around in 1912 was what to do about the trusts. And the division here was between Woodrow Wilson, who advocated for the new freedom, and Theodore Roosevelt, who advocated for the new nationalism. By this time, William Howard Taft knew he was going to lose the election, and he was essentially relegated to third place. The Republican Party's nominee was actually the third party in 1912. And it was these two people, Wilson and Roosevelt, who were the leading candidates. Woodrow Wilson's view was that of the new freedom. And the argument of Woodrow Wilson was, we need to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up these monopolies. We need to bust the trusts. In fact, you see this little pamphlet over here, a Democratic campaign song, Bust the Trusts. We need to go back to the time when these large corporations didn't exist. We need to make them smaller. We need to bust them up. Wilson's argument is, let's be trust busters. And that was his view in the New Freedom. Roosevelt took a different approach. He advocated for what he called the new nationalism, which was the view of the new nationalism was, we need to accept the existence of big business. We need to accept the existence of monopolies, and we should not be busting all trusts. We should distinguish between the good trusts and the bad trusts. And in fact, the good trusts, we should use government to control them rather than to break them up. Here's what Theodore Roosevelt said in his speech that became known as the New Nationalism speech. Combinations in industry, that is trusts, are the result of an imperative economic law which cannot be repealed by political legislation. The effort at prohibiting all combination has substantially failed. The way out lies not in attempting to prevent such combinations, but in completely controlling them in the interest of the public welfare. Now, here's a fascinating aspect of the 1912 election that very few history books, I think, emphasize, and that very few people understand. Theodore Roosevelt is known in the popular mind as the great trust buster. Here's the great irony of this. Of all of the candidates in 1912, the person who was the least interested in trust busting was Theodore Roosevelt. He was the person who said, we have to stop focusing on trust busting. And in fact, during his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt was not much of a trust buster. William Howard Taft was the great trust buster in American history. Theodore Roosevelt said, instead of getting rid of these big corporations, these big monopolies, these big combinations, we should use government to regulate and control them, keep them in existence, and have government be a partner with big business rather than trying to prevent big business from emerging or breaking up big business when it does emerge. So here's the fascinating thing. The trust busters in 1912 were William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, and the person who rejected trust busting was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, in spite of that argument, Theodore Roosevelt was actually quite popular and was really a formidable candidate for Wilson. I think Wilson knew he was going to win because clearly the Republicans were divided in 1912 and they were going to divide up their votes, which would leave a united Democratic Party in a good position to win the presidency. But things took a very strange turn in October of 1912. The October surprise that we often talk about with presidential elections took on incredible proportions in the 1912 election. And here's a photo of Theodore Roosevelt riding to give in an open air convertible automobile, riding in Milwaukee to give a speech in Milwaukee. He's obviously surrounded by an enormous crowd, as he was just about everywhere he went in 1912. As he was heading to the auditorium to give the speech, a man shot him at close range in the chest, and Roosevelt went down, and everybody thought for sure that he had been mortally wounded. Roosevelt immediately popped up. He put his hand on his mouth, and he didn't see blood coming out, and he said, "I think this means that the bullet has not punctured my chest, and I think this means that I'm not fatally wounded." And so, in spite of everybody telling him, "You need to go to the hospital, you've just been shot in the chest," Roosevelt continues to give the speech. He has the automobile take him to the auditorium in Milwaukee, and he gives the speech. And when he gets there, he says, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And everybody is cheering, and also, of course, in awe of this man who has just been shot in the chest and is still going to give a speech. He says, "The bullet is still in me now, so I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." He spoke for nearly 90 minutes after that preface. And in fact, he showed everybody the speech that he had folded in his pocket. He had a 50-page speech folded in his pocket. The bullet, as you can see in this picture, actually went through the speech and through the case that held his glasses. And we speculate today that it was the speech and the glasses in his pocket that saved his life, that they somehow stopped the bullet so that he was not mortally wounded in the attempt. Nevertheless, Roosevelt was severely injured. He was bleeding out of his chest while he was giving the speech, and he often would open, during the speech, periodically, he would open his coat to show everybody the blood seeping out of his chest while he was speaking, and going on for nearly 90 minutes. I can't think of a performance in a presidential campaign that matches anything like this. This is incredible. An incredible end to the 1912 election. Roosevelt obviously has to suspend his campaign for a few weeks while he recovers from the wound. And Wilson himself says he's going to suspend his campaign out of respect for his opponent. And so this is the way the 1912 election ends, with a third-party candidate who's captivated the country, almost succumbing to an assassin's bullet, being saved by his own speech, continuing to give the speech at Madison Square or at Milwaukee. And then on his return, October 30th, he gives a speech in Madison Square Garden. And when he arrives in Madison Square Garden, he's greeted with a 45-minute ovation. A 45-minute ovation awaits him. And everyone speculates it would have gone on 60, 70 minutes had he not signaled very clearly his interest in starting to speak. This is part of the sort of larger than life figure that Theodore Roosevelt was, and the lasting impact that he left on this campaign and on the country as a whole. And so that is how the election of 1912 transpires heading into Election Day. Here you see a map with the election result in 1912. The incumbent candidate, excuse me, William Howard Taft, wins 2 states, 8 electoral votes, He wins the states of Vermont and Utah. Okay, excuse me, I just had a little bit of a coughing spell. So Taft wins 2 states, Vermont and Utah, which is a great trivia question for you history and political buffs. What are the 2 states that Taft wins in 1912? Utah and Vermont, probably the 2 of the most polarized states today, but in the opposite direction. Theodore Roosevelt wins 88 electoral college votes. He wins 27% of the vote to Taft's 23%. And Woodrow Wilson wins an enormous victory, 435 electoral votes and 42% of the popular vote. And this is Wilson's first successful election. He will win a second term in 1916. He will guide the country through World War I. But interestingly, Woodrow Wilson's first term in office saw the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, which was there to regulate monopoly and big business rather than break it up, and the 17th Amendment, which gave you the direct election of United States senators. In other words, Woodrow Wilson, although he campaigned as a new freedom advocate of breaking up the trusts, he governed like Theodore Roosevelt was campaigning under the new nationalism. And a fellow named Herbert Croly, one of the leading journalists of the Progressive Era, man who first coined the phrase new nationalism, and who was very close to Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, famously wrote, "The new freedom has been discarded," by Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson ends up governing a lot like Theodore Roosevelt said he was going to govern on the campaign trail. And to bring the story full circle, Wilson is succeeded in office by Warren Harding, who wins an election in 1920 promising a return to normalcy. And during his first term in office, President Harding appoints William Howard Taft to the Supreme Court, which was the place where William Howard Taft always wanted to be. We speculate that he didn't really want to be president of the United States. He actually wanted to be on the Supreme Court. And so the man who finishes third in 1912 is appointed by Wilson's successor to join the Supreme Court, where he enjoys a very distinguished career. So all of these things make for an incredible story, a real story, a true story, but an incredible story of a very fascinating presidential election. But it's not just an interesting story. This is a really important election as well. It was the beginning of direct primaries, which of course is how all presidential candidates today are nominated. There really aren't any super delegates anymore who can decide, even when the people don't support a particular candidate, that they're going to choose a different candidate for their party. Now, if you want to win your party's nomination, you have to go straight to the people. You have to campaign for the office. The office no longer seeks the person has to seek the office. And this means that elections today are much more about candidates and less about parties. In fact, the candidates will often distance themselves from their parties and run entirely almost as independents. Even though they technically are running as a Republican or a Democrat, they often like to portray themselves as individuals. Don't think of me as a member of a party, just think of me as my own image, my own brand. The elections would be much more about the candidates and their personalities than about the parties and their principles. And this means a shift away from focusing on the principles of a party and much more on the personality of candidates. And if the personality of the candidates becomes much more important in an election, this means you have to focus a lot more on fundraising and on using the media to get your message out, on the use of rhetoric, on how one looks, on the appearances of a candidate, how you cultivate an image. You use celebrity endorsements in order to show that you are interesting, that you can relate to the people. And so you see a huge shift in the way campaigns are run today, which is largely the result of this change to a more direct democratic process, where you have to raise a lot of money, you have to spend a lot of money, you have to focus on your personality, you have to show that you're relatable, you have to go out and campaign actively and incessantly. This makes for only certain kinds of candidates now who can run for president. William Howard Taft really was suited for the old style of campaign. Theodore Roosevelt was suited for the new style of campaign. And there would be a lot more people like Roosevelt and a lot fewer people like Taft from here on out. And I guess the last reason why the 1912 election is important is because it determined, to a great extent, the future of the two parties. The Republican Party, as Taft understood, was making a choice to move in a more conservative direction rather than a progressive direction. Right? Faced with the choice between a conservative progressive like Taft and a progressive like Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican Party chose the conservative. And this meant that the Republican Party would now be seen as the more conservative party. And this is obviously how the Republican Party has evolved since the 1912 election. Of course, the Republican Party didn't immediately become a purely conservative party. Even through the 60s and the 70s, the 1960s and the 1970s, there were liberal Republicans, particularly in the Northeast. But the Republican Party gradually, and I think because of the 1912 election, the Republican Party becomes gradually more conservative. And of course, the opposite happens to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the more conservative party in 1912. And although it takes a lot longer for the Democratic Party to become the liberal party, which really doesn't happen until probably the 1970s and 1980s, the Democratic Party is put on the path to progressivism, and largely due to what happens at its nominating convention and having Woodrow Wilson viewed as the leader of the party for 8 years. Of course, it would be Franklin Roosevelt, a little over a decade later, who would really make the Democratic Party a more progressive party. But Woodrow Wilson played a large role in paving the way towards somebody like a Franklin Roosevelt. And so the 1912 election is a pivotal moment in American history. It's a fascinating election in which the candidates seem almost larger than life. The drama is made for television or made for cinema. And in fact, an incredible movie or documentary could be made about this election. But it's also an election that is interesting not just in its own respect, but also for its long-term implications for the way American politics works today. We really have presidential campaigns today that are run in the shadow of the 1912 election. And if you're looking for an election to explain to students what put America on the path that it's on today, what put the Republican Party on it, the path that it is on, and the Democratic Party on the path that it is on, and what paved the way towards the more democratic, very expensive, media-driven, hype-driven kinds of presidential campaigns that we have today, I think the 1912 election is the leading contender for explaining how all of this came to be. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to spend some time looking at this election, talking about it. And I look forward to the opportunity to do that with you live over Zoom with many of you in the near future. Thank you very much for watching this, and have a wonderful day. Take care.